Hey, everybody, welcome to the Game Junkie Show, episode 18. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. I have my co host with me tonight, Logiq. And as some of you will remember, back on around episode 13 or so, we were talking about how games have been changing generationally over the years and kind of talking about if games are getting harder or not. And some really cool things came up in that conversation, including the electronic ROI, which I'm sure we'll dig into today. And Logiq had this really cool phrase that he used, which was gamer know thyself, kind of talking about how it's up to us to have the responsibility of deciding really what we get joy out of and really kind of being in control of our content and not letting anybody else pressure us and not letting our expectations kind of get out of line. So, hey, Logiq, how are you this evening?
Good, good. How are you?
I'm hanging in there, man. So, why don't you tell us a little, just kind of remind me, and just in case anybody didn't watch episode 13, um, kind of remind me where the gamer know thyself, like where did that come from you? How did you spawn on this idea?
Yeah, so it's a bit funny. We were trying to record this a little bit earlier, and I think now I'm going to switch what my original explanation was. So, so let me take it back even a step further. Um, so you guessed correctly. I am an engineer. You asked that question last time we were on, and one of the things we do as engineers, one of the things that's very big, um, and I've kind of incorporated this in my personal life as I think it's appropriate is everyone needs to understand, particularly when it comes to consumer electronics, right? Everyone needs to understand what their requirements are. Um, for anybody who's bought a house, right, this is a huge thing that you go through, particularly if you're buying a house with another person, right? Because your needs and what this is a ginormous expense, right? That's going to characterize many, many years of your life. And so understanding what it is that you're paying for and what you want to pay for and what you don't want to pay for, hugely important. Same thing with a car. Same thing with a lot of other things. We seem to start to forget those a little bit when we distill things down to the lower end of consumer electronics. Um, but this also becomes true in terms of entertainment. So part of this comes from a lot of the time that I've spent as a reviewer of, you know, hardware, software, movies, television, etc. You talk about a movie and you talk about whether or not you characterize that movie as good or not. And in those discussion circles, we go through a lot of there are people who get bent out of shape about a thing, and you have to determine as a moviegoer, right, whether or not that particular thing is a thing that you care about, right, or not. Um, a lot of times when I talk about a movie, you know, when I'm not necessarily trying to assign a score to it, I just talk about the fact that look, I just want to be entertained. I don't need every movie to be an Oscar-winning performance because I don't want to see that every single weekend, right? Am I entertained? Am I not bored? Right? Does my mind start to drift and wander? Are there things that like plot holes that I can't figure out? Um, some very intense discussions around like the Star Wars, the last three chapters when they came out, and I talked about plot holes, and people said I was getting wrapped around. Well, if wrapped around the axle, well, if you're a person who those things don't bother, then that's your set of requirements, and those things are okay for you. They're not for me, right? Because I tend to lean towards things with highly structured systems and like a Star Trek, right, where there's a Starfleet Academy and where there are ranks and where all those holes are kind of filled in, right? It's structured, um, and so those are things that I acclimate towards. So in all these things, I have in my head this notion of requirements and a need to identify what those things are. They were pieces of this that I started putting together as I got into technical hardware reviews because people would ask me very frequently for recommendations on what do I need, what should I buy for a phone, what should I buy for a laptop, what should I buy for a tablet. And it was often a discussion between the two of us of, okay, let me come to understand what your requirements are, right? Lots of complaints, for example, about phones when phones got really big, right? That was a huge thing for people. I would listen to podcasts and they would go on and on and on and on about, phones are too big. It doesn't feel good in the hand, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, my requirement is to pack as much information onto a screen at one time as possible because I know that I'm more productive and my workflow is faster, right? If I'm reading web pages, I read more when I have to scroll less, right? So this is me, modulating requirements and understanding, things that fit. Um, and in the debate of like Apple products versus other products, I will frequently say you want to spend a lot of money on a lot of product. Do you really need those things? Are those your requirements? So all of these things kind of were part of this foundational primitive, if you will. As I started getting into live streaming, I started kind of losing my footing to a certain extent at that time in my life, just because of streaming and what we were doing on the podcast and some of what I was doing with blogging. And I started kind of losing my grip on certain things from a gaming perspective. It was becoming more complex. Um, I dipped my toes into Star Citizen, and when I got disappointed in Star Citizen, I started thinking, well, I've never really participated in this MMO thing. Should I become an MMO guy? Does that appeal to me? Um, I got into World of Warships a couple of years ago, and I was like, so people don't debate me about me calling it a MOBA. I call World of Warships a MOBA because that's the genre that I stuff it in. We can argue about whether or not it's a MOBA or not later, um, but I was like, so should I get into more MOBAs? So out of all this, I started trying to formulate, and I was losing a lot of time, right? Because I kept trying to go back to Star Citizen, and that game doesn't work. That's another argument. But and I kept glomming onto these other things, and I was like, my normal vector of how I make like my playlist is not satisfying me anymore. I'm second guessing myself. I'm asking all these questions, and I felt the need to come up with a model and a framework that defined kind of what brought me joy and happiness. This is kind of the digital version of like the Marie Kondo kind of thing, right? Does a thing bring you joy, and if it doesn't bring you joy, get rid of it, right? Um, and so there's a little element of that, right? What I started trying to do was started trying to package. You kind of were messing with it today a little bit on Twitter, where you had that meme of like all the different categories of game variables and stuff, and how you
Yeah.
kind of stack and think about those. That's kind of in the same vein. To allow me to help me to give me something to lean on to like figure out what it was that I was looking for and what appealed to me, the things that and identify the things that didn't bother me, to help kind of formulate games I wanted to buy, games I wanted to play, and where I wanted to spend my time.
Super cool. And it's crazy that I never, it's so logical, but it's stuff, well, that's why they call you logic. It's stuff that we don't think about because so many real world things we don't realize are applicable to us. I worked in the software industry for a handful of years, and in the discovery process, you go in and you try to learn all the requirements and you try to learn all the details and you try to create the software that under the hood is going to perform all the needs that the company has and that the user interface is going to be the best way they can learn it. And it's all these same steps that are applicable to so many things, including what we're talking about. But to say I'm going to apply them in my own life and my content is something we don't do. So we sit here and somebody says, well, this is a great movie. And we don't even think we're going to like the movie, but we watch the movie out of obligation, right? Or people really wanted me to like Metal Gear Solid, and I was like, I don't get it. Maybe I'm not smart enough to understand Kojima. I don't know. I just don't get these games. They're just, I don't know. It's just not for me. Scary games. I don't want anxiety. It's not for me. And thinking about it after you said, you know what? It's okay. You don't have to enjoy games out of obligation because other people like them, and you don't have to enjoy it because it got a good, I don't even look at scores. I don't care what number you say it is I don't care what number it is to you. I care what it is to me. So if, I have friends that may like the same games as me and they say, I like this, but I'm a believer that you should play it for yourself. But if you think this genre, this style, this thing is not really going to be for me, then maybe it's not for you. And that's completely okay, right? I mean, that's essentially what gamer know thyself means. And I will show let's show my screen here just real quick. So for anybody who didn't see this, I want to show it because after, we talked and after I got with Logic, I sat down and I said, I took several days, probably close to a week, and I said, what are the 4 characteristics that mean the most to me to get to that point of optimal fulfillment? And I was able to come up with that, as you can see here, and that just solidified that I have been playing the right games for me because they meet these requirements. In the games that I've been hesitant to try, Doesn't mean I won't like them, doesn't mean I won't ever try them. But like you said, we're limited on time. If you focus your time on the things that do meet your requirements of what you really enjoy, you're more likely to get to that point of optimal fulfillment. Maybe you get there better, maybe you get there faster. So, what do you kind of, is there anything that you kind of want to add to that logic or dig in deeper in regards to that?
Well, just in so much that philosophical approach changes the optic on so many of the discussions in my mind, so many of the maybe bad discussions that happen on Twitter, right? Or
Hmm.
conversational vectors that come up. I look at your chart and I go back to this argument about Game Pass, right? And the camp who is of this mindset that Game Pass is renting games and like you don't own anything and you shouldn't pay somebody to like borrow a game. And I'm like, here's what you need to understand, right? Because this is all about time and this is all about fulfillment. Gamer Know Thyself is about not wasting uh, times not wasting, right. So I think of time as a finite resource, right. I think of the years of my life as a finite resource, right. I'm trying to maximize and optimize the gaming goodness that I get out of that lifetime. I don't necessarily want to wander in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, right, trying to figure things out. And so, or if I do, I want that to be of value. What's the return on all that discovery and growing up, right? Kind of as a gamer. It's only valuable if I then use that to kind of vector where I'm and how I'm going to spend my time. So people talk about Game Pass and they talk about, like I said, it's ephemeral. Like you don't own anything. I'm like, yeah, you're right, because I've said, here's my optimization diagram, right, of where I want to spend my gaming time, and as far as that is concerned, where I want to spend my gaming money, right, and so those are the titles that I want to spend the $60 or $70 on at a pop and own. You know, again, have another philosophical discussion about whether or not you ever own any software. Um, that it being in and of itself an intangible object. Um, so, so yeah. Given that I want to participate in the conversation on games, that to a certain extent, if you want, for whatever reason, I've chosen that participating in that discussion is kind of my second job, right? That that fulfills some part of my like societal interaction. I don't want to have to spend, and I don't have the time to spend $60 and $70, right, in the requisite time on every game under the sun. I don't mind prioritizing the games that I want to spend time on, and the games that maybe I only want to casually borrow or rent or own in an ephemeral, existence. I'm fine for that stuff to exist in Game Pass. And price sensitivity wise, the cost doesn't bother me, right? So let me have my thing, right? And stop trying to take it away from me because I haven't submitted myself to your judgment on how I spend my money, right?
People do like to gatekeep, don't they? I've always wondered why anyone wants to legislate someone else's behavior or try and control someone else's like joy. Like how can you how can you define what someone else's joy is? And if somebody has joy, why are you trying to take it away?
Yeah, and I mean, and it's not unique to the gaming industry. We go through this, like I said, in other mediums as well. We've now that like we have all these Marvel movies, right? There's been people who have tried to define and gatekeep like what those things are supposed to be, or what race characters are supposed to be, or the world flipping out because the girl in Hunger Games was black and in the book she was supposed to be white when in reality the author had never given that character a defined color or ethnicity. And it's all of these. I mean, it's going to sound a little bit hypocritical because I just went on this long diatribe about like how I built the structure, but I built that structure for myself. I didn't say everybody else had to apply to that structure, right? I just conveyed it as a thing that might be helpful to other people. And if somebody has the opinion that that's not a good fit for them and they don't want to overthink it that much and they have a much more intuitive feel for how they want it, then great, right? Then that works for you. Um, but we build these structures in society and around culture and entertainment, and now in the world of social media take those things out to the web, and and try and build these fiefdoms that we try and force other people to live under. And I don't really understand that vector, except as you often mention, right, that it's a matter of clout, right? That it's not sufficient for me to convey or have a discussion. What I really need to do is win an argument.
It could be that, but I think in some cases it is. Other cases, I think, I mean, this is just to think, gaming is something some of us are really passionate about. We fucking love this. And when you're really passionate about something, you're often emotional about it. And emotional about it doesn't mean that you're sad. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're angry. It just there's a lot of emotions, and those emotions are strong. So maybe you want to defend your favorite game or your favorite genre, and you think because you're emotional at the time because of how passionate you're super passionate about Halo. Like you love Halo. It's the greatest series of all time. I mean, it's like Xbox's gold. You love it. Okay, you're so passionate about it. And then I'm like, honest, I stopped liking Halo like this. I just don't. I wouldn't shit on someone's Halo parade because that's not me. But you might take offense that I don't like it and think. I'm just trying to rationalize where people might be. People might also not understand the difference between something being opinion and something being factual. I mean, opinions are just, they don't mean anything more than that. I feel like sometimes when I look at it, and the best analogy I can give you is like if you know a really religious person who tries to preach to you, or you know a vegan who feels really great with their diet and they try to bring it up to you. Sometimes people are preachy because it's important to them. So imagine the analogy that there's a building that's on fire and you're about to run into it, and they think they're doing you a favor by warning you. So I don't think all of these conversations are you're an idiot, you're not allowed to have an opinion. I think somebody might have that preachiness because they think that they're helping you, or they think maybe you're missing out on something. Does that kind of make sense? I think all of these dynamics are involved, so it's not so easy for us to kind of digest all these dynamics that we see on the internet. I mean, does that make sense?
You're a much more forgiving person than I am, and a better human being than I am. I've just traveled. I've just traveled the arc long enough that I've just lost. I mean, I don't want to say I've lost the tolerance. I try, and when I engage in a no, maybe I should be truthful. I've probably lost the tolerance. I have a threshold where when I engage in conversation, there's a number of drum beats that I'm gonna stick with it, right? And then at a certain point, I'm done, right?
Mhm.
And I probably where I've gotten into probably my deepest darkest holes is when I've extended that
Mhm.
beyond probably what was healthy for me, where I've tried to accommodate and I've tried to listen, and the person has just been toxic and one-sided and myopic, and just it's not a conversation of it's so rare. And again, I go back to why I'm so happy that you do this series. It's so rare that in Twitter conversations we ever hear, I want to hear your perspective, or that's a way to think about it, right? What I more often, in one of the things you brought up just a minute ago, and one of the things that just kind of always kind of makes my skin crawl is the response. Well, that's just your personal opinion. Yeah, everything that we're talking about is everybody's personal opinion and our own biases, right? It's not that it's my personal opinion when you don't agree with it, but it's fact of the universe, right? When you express it, like I don't, and so what I I I understand what you were saying. I
Mhm.
just I've probably just grown to a point where I've lost my tolerance for
Which is totally okay. I think I sometimes, hmm, I might have a problem of holding too much faith in humanity very frequently. I sometimes I think I'm good at knowing when to walk away, but I am a very very tolerant creature. Sometimes too much because it's very hard to like get my hackles up and frazzle me. So maybe I don't know if I don't know if that's necessarily the most positive thing or not. I don't know, but I know that I got this way from coming from a life that was very different. Growing up in a more, we grew up poor and kind of in an abusive environment, and life taught me to be a little angrier and more myopic out of fear. And I learned that if you're tolerant and you can hear the opinions of other people, there's a lot that you can learn there. There's a lot of takeaways there, even if it doesn't change your mind, to understand how people tick. And we have a huge community on Twitter, and we don't all like the same things and we don't all agree on everything. But if you can learn from people and develop mutual respect, and you can share those passions with that people, that's kind of what it's all about. But again, gamer, you have to know yourself. You have to know where your limits are. You kind of have to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, that sort of thing. I have noticed, I will say, you seem to get that little bit of, when people are really inconsistent about their criticism, is a thing that I can tell you. Let's talk about that a little bit, because I know you have a lot to say on the topic, but that's the thing that you and I both go, like, if you're very inconsistent in your criticism, or you and I like to say when we're watching content, stick to the rules. So let's let's talk about that, because I know you have so much insight when we kind of say those terms.
Yeah, and I might not have his Twitter handle right. Was it Pillow who kind of started a conversation
Oh,
up in this
yeah, it's a
space?
Pillow Fort, our boy Pillow Fort.
Yeah, so Pillow had started a thread where he mentioned, um, kind of jokingly that the same people who will complain about who will give this one other thing a pass, will complain about this other thing.
What
That
was the
has been
fruit? Like, sometimes fruit busts and sometimes it doesn't, but it was like the fruit window exploding vegetation stuff.
right, right. And there's a shade of that element that I understand that maybe we'll talk about later. But in general, um, yeah, I feel the same way. We have this saying in one of the professional circles that I used to be in and am still kind of around, and we talk about truing up, right, or true up, and that's a means of, right. It's a mathematical means, right? It's just a matter of, hey, making sure that the left hand side of your equation equals the right hand side of your equation. But it's also a matter in a business sense of, um, making sure that a you know mathematical figure is synonymous with the text that you've written about it, right? I've spent, unfortunately, a ton of time in my life, for instance, writing performance evaluations, right, on employees for people at work. And one of the things I used to always teach junior managers is like, look, like don't give me a scorecard with a person, who's a 5 on a 5-point scale, right? But then not have like commensurate text that equals that, right? Or don't tell me the person is the greatest thing since John Paul Jones, but then tell me that the person is a 3.0 metrically. Like those things aren't consistent. They don't true up. And so the conversation that Pillow brought up, and what I was thinking about is, yes, that's correct, right? And this obviously cuts into fanboyism and things like that, but people will complain about a thing and give another thing a pass, and that thread goes back to that gamer know thyself, but also gets squelched down by that notion of understanding the way you perceive your entertainment ROI, right? What gives you value, what gives you happiness, what gives you joy. I think part of what he mentioned kind of gets explained away because, as a for instance, there are things that bug us, right, different entertainment mediums, and then there are things that are not. Um, one thing is, for instance, like, you can't go see a legal movie or watch a procedural legal drama with a lawyer, right? Because they're constantly talking about the things that bug them, right? They can't enjoy that. Things I've done, right? If I'm going to enjoy a certain movie that deals with certain topics, I have to go into that kind of relaxing and backing myself away from, well, first of all, that's wrong, and no, I can't talk to you about why it's wrong, but it really bugs me why it's wrong, right? So, um, but but part of the problem in the area that Pillow talked about is people don't like to admit that, and I think that's what part of the problem is. Um, I know I'm going on for a while, but I'll loop this back to the example, to the Miles Morales example. Spent several months on Twitter, going back and forth with people over about Miles Morales, and often it wasn't about things that I said, but things that somebody else said that I agreed with. Right. So, right, wrong, or indifferent. Right. Miles Morales to me is Spider-Man DLC. Right. It's a breadth of content that is less than the totality of the content of the original Spider-Man game. And I don't feel that the Miles Morales title that was delivered at the PlayStation 5 launch is equivalent to the Spider-Man title itself. It's not the same amount of content. It's not the same amount of gameplay time. And right, wrong, or indifferent, the way I perceive things, you mentioned working in the software industry, so do I. Everything is typified by the number of hours that it takes an engineer to get a thing done. And the simple fact of the matter is that the software developers didn't spend as much time on Miles Morales as they did on Spider-Man, right? Even though they had to apply the graphical upgrades, simply not the equivalent level of effort. And in my software world, that's how everything's priced, right? Again, maybe I'm limited. Maybe I am, have a certain, inability, right, to enjoy entertainment because of that software industry perspective, but that's the way I perceive the thing. And so spent a lot of time with people talking about that and a lot of people not wanting to hear that, right? Because what they wanted to hear and what they were in love with and what they wanted justified was that they felt Spider-Man, the title, was the greatest thing since sliced bread. The arrival of Miles Morales was huge. It to them equated as a launch title. Whereas again, I go back to my perception. I'm like, that's not a launch title, right? The way I perceive it and the way I define things. And so went fought back and forth furiously, right? Finally just got to the point with at least a couple people. People just said, look, I don't care. I love Spider-Man. That's my one of my biggest properties that I've loved since I was a child. This thing is trying to remember how we refer to it. This thing is a love story for me, right? And I'm like, there we go, right? Look, if you love a thing, just say that you love a thing, and you're fine paying that price for it. You don't care about the like kind of stuff, right? But don't tell me that mathematically what I'm saying is incorrect because it's not, right? This is an instance where the left side of the equation doesn't agree with the right hand side, but that becomes okay in a conversation when you can admit and convey to everyone that there's an emotional context to that that defies, right, your other perceptions of things. And I think what Pillow is talking about is that same group of people who will then say, "Yeah, but I don't want to pay $60 for right for some other thing that to me doesn't equate to a full game," right? And that's that application of a dual standard in the same, but within the same context. If that all makes sense.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And I'm going to go back to my eROI here because I'm glad Miles Morales came up, and I'm glad that you and I have different opinions on it actually, because there's a really wild concept that I'm going to pitch to people watching that might blow some heads. So if we look at my optimal fulfillment, I was I was fulfilled optimally with Miles Morales. I liked the story, I liked the narrative journey, loved the character development. Finn is one of my favorite NPCs. Like, I could do a whole episode gushing on my love for Finn and why those characters were so like politically necessary. I loved the environment. I mean, I loved the gameplay. I didn't mind the cost. It did all of those things for me. And here's a cool concept. Both me and Logic are right because our opinion is our opinion. And if we feel that way, it's true to us. And we can sit here and be like, that's cool. We both feel different ways about this game based on our gamer know thyself and the way that we look and the way that we digest it and the way. And we can both be right because your opinion can't be wrong. It's your opinion, right? If you feel a certain way, you can't be wrong about the way that you feel. It's the way that you feel. I mean, that's kind of what, I mean, isn't it what is kind of missing sometimes is people just can't, you know what I mean? That these people could have been like, well, we see things differently, and that's okay. We're all right because we like what we like, and we have to keep reverting back to our. This is why I love the eROI chart, and I wish more people would do it because it really helps kind of solidify and remind you that your opinions are validated, and you like what you like, and you're allowed to and you're allowed to be passionate. Like I can go, oh my God, Logic, this game is so cool. You got to try it. Logic can go, yeah, I tried it, but I thought it was a little short, for the money. I thought these inconsistencies with it. Oh, okay. It's that simple, right?
Right, and as you mentioned, right, the key element in that is I mean, so you first have to know. I talk a lot of times with teams about playbooks and audibles, and I think one of the failures in our life is we go through life very much thinking that quarterbacks who come up to the line of scrimmage and call an audible are flying by the seat of their pants. And I'm like, no, the audibles are also in the playbook, right? They walk up to the line, they recognize a misalignment, and they think to, okay, what are the contingency plans, right, that I have in place? And the analog to this is you first have to define what your rubric and what your framework is, from my perception or the way I kind of came around to this, right? And so that is that entertainment ROI framework, right? There has to be a baseline. There has to be a thing. There can't just be tons of exceptions, right? Because if your life is nothing but a bunch of exceptions, then there's never any. How the heck are they exceptions when there's not anything for them to be exceptions to? So, so I have this framework of a ground line and a basis, and then when I make exceptions to that, I get triggered to make sure that I convey, understand that I'm making an exception. We talk about this a lot on E2KG. We'll go through this kind of Socratic method where somebody will have an opinion and will say, okay, but what about this? But what about this? But what about that? And at the end, what we try and get to is, yes, you're right. That's how I normally think about it. But I'm telling you that in this one case, for whatever reasons, and we try to articulate those reasons, right? There's an exception, right? I don't normally like subscription games, but Star Citizen has some particular flavors in the mix, and I'm okay paying for that, right?
Mhm.
Or, I normally, we go back to that Miles Morales thing. Hey, look, one of my favorite games of all time, maybe arguably my favorite game of all time, was Max Payne, the first game. That game's like 8 to 9 hours of content, right? That's the first time you run through it, right? It's shorter when you go through it the second time, right? I
Mhm.
had zero problems paying full price for that game and would pay full price for that game on any day of the week, right? Because that game did some specific things that pulled at some heartstrings emotionally and worked for me. That thing is an exception to a lot of my kind of normal rules, but but in order to convey that and get through that conversation with another gamer who might say, "Hey, you like Max Payne, but yet you're ragging on Miles Morales. That's not consistent." I'm like, you're right, but what got left out of the conversation was you didn't tell me that you're in love with Spider-Man and he's been your hero since you were a kid, right? Captain America was mine. I would probably pay full price for a Captain America game where I got to experience the life of Steve Rogers, right? You have to include that in the mix in order to convey your understanding. You can't just have this set of inconsistencies and exception riddled logic, right, in conveying your story to people and coloring your interactions with people on Twitter, which I think is where you get to Pillow's perspective, where he goes, "Hey, you guys are okay with Call of Duty and everybody being bullet sponges, but then you're crapping on fruit not exploding the right way. What are we complaining about here?"
No, totally understand that. And since you mentioned quarterbacks and football and audibles, I want to give a big shout out to my personal goat, most cerebral, big, beautiful, four-headed, big-brained quarterback, Peyton Manning, my man, making it into the Hall of Fame. That's my baby. That's love Peyton. Good job, Peyton. I cried when he retired. But yeah, I have exceptions. I mean, you guys have seen that my chart is really, I love single player, heavy narrative, you know, emotional consequences, decision making. I love long, epic cutscenes. I love that shit. Okay. Right now, I'm playing the Division 2. It is not story heavy. There's not much character development. It's not like, I mean, there's some lore and environment. It's just okay. I'm getting fulfillment out of that because we've been playing online. Like Logic and I have a couple of play dates scheduled where we play, and I've been playing with shout out to Lovable. It's fun to play online with friends. If you're having fun, you can make exceptions. Just don't be really critical with the inconsistency. Exceptions are okay, but if it's, I may not be articulating it well, but it's hard to, I think if most people sat back and looked at their gaming library and looked at kind of their play style and their stats, they would see that there's a lot of consistencies. And then there's some stuff that are exceptions because it's just so fun and it's just so good. But we have to be reasonable in our criticism of looking at details in games. I mean, some stuff, it's okay if some shit in the background doesn't blow up like it, you know what I mean? Just identify the things that the game is supposed to be good at. Like when we're playing the Division 2, the gunplay feels great. Like the barrels get hot, the bullets discharge, like how the bullets hit in and how they affect. That's authentic. That's what needs to be authentic. It doesn't need all the rest of those elements. And that's a little bit of kind of, at least the way I feel about how people should kind of keep some consistencies, is be reasonably fair about what the game is and what should be authentic in that game.
Yeah, and I think I think from my perspective too, there's also there's a veneer where there's space where the notion of authenticity can mean a different thing, right?
Hmm.
So particularly when it comes to shooters, um, and in some ways, shooters are kind of the most non-special genre out there because there's so many of them. But when you really dig into them very deeply, there are some very special, unique things about them, and some very particular vectors of design. And one of those things for me is gunplay just needs to be fun. Like
Yes.
and so some of the conversation we were having today and yesterday on Twitter, some people were, there was a conversation about a high focus on reality and kind of that authenticity, and I was like, for me, like, look, Destiny 2 is fun because it has one of the best gunplay, I don't know, dynamics, right, that I've experienced in a game, right? It doesn't have to do with reality because none of those weapons are real. It just feels good. And the same is very much true of the Division too. I feel like, a lot of people um, express opinions where they're not pleased with the Division 2, and it's about, the amount of content and how the end game is and things like that. And I'm like, look, I just, it's just gunplay. And this is where, for my eROI, um, story is a thing, but like you can exceed that, right, by having that really great gunplay. Borderlands, for instance, probably arguably has more story, more structure, more lore around it than, maybe not a Destiny 2, but then some other things. Let's say than the Division 2. But the gunplay of Borderlands doesn't feel as good to me as Destiny 2 or the Division 2. And so I'm much more interested in spending more time in the Division 2 than Borderlands. Um, in Borderlands 2, the gunplay just kind of has this effect where it kind of becomes numbing after a while, and I don't feel as engaged with my loadouts and other things. So that's, just for instance. I think another part of the problem with, people, you know where so many things are like an exception, like somebody's flying off the handle and being very toxic about a thing that's really for them an exception, but they're standing on that pillar as if that's their norm. Um, and one of the things that I think that creates, that's problematic in how those conversations go, is there's a high degree of quickness to be dismissive, and I think that's a problem when you're really trying to build a conversation. And and one thing is look, if if there's a ring of truth, go back to truing up, right? If there's a ring of truth, we talk about this article. I can't remember who all was in the thread, but we talk about this article about that was written about dissatisfactions with the PlayStation 5, right? I felt like 80% of the things that were in that article were all true and valid, right? Makes a difference whether or not those things matter to you, right? A lot of those things didn't matter to me, like how you turn the PlayStation 5 off, right? Is that a really big problem? No. Do I recognize that you can no longer just hold down the PS button and that brings up the power menu like it used to do on the PlayStation 3 and the PlayStation 4? Yeah, that's valid. I don't know why that got taken away or pulled out. It was easier to get through that from a workflow flow perspective than it was before. So that's a valid criticism to me. The fact that there's a negative delta, right, in the comparison to how it worked before. You can pick or choose whether or not that thing really matters to you. But but this but there's a high speed in dismissiveness about that to just say they brought up something that doesn't matter to me, so therefore their entire argument like is pointless. I'm like, no, like again, consider that other gamers have other requirements than you, and so some of those might be important. I'll pick out another thing in that article. 1440p not being on the PlayStation 5 makes a difference to me because my monitors in the studio are core centered around 1440p. I tend not to play at 4K. Um, so when I move my PlayStation 5, which I do frequently because I also live stream, and I bring it over to a display, and I can't play in 1440p, but I can on my Xbox. So so that impacts me, right? So I don't take that whole article and crumple it up and throw it in the trash and dismiss it because a lot of its points are valid. Where those points hit me, right, are different, right, across the spectrum. But but again, I don't approach that with this air of dismissiveness. One of the things I mentioned a few weeks ago is because even those of us who are trying to be the good guys, right, on Twitter, my concern is that when we are dismissive about things like that, we we are ourselves becoming gatekeepers and are making an attempt to invalidate requirements that may be of pertinence to someone else. And so, yes, I think it's important that there be a dialogue about trying to keep down the trash labeling and the garbage talking and things like that. But I feel like we need to be careful about totally invalidating what what other people indicate or criticisms about a thing.
That's really a great point. I mean, and I know that Tony got a lot of stuff for him, but I think it was the way he worded it. I thought I saw a tweet that made it sound like it's hard to figure out how to turn it off, which I think the source of where it came from stemmed to a little more humor. I mean, it is extra clicks if it affects somebody. I mean, I understand it's reasonable. I try not to be dismissive. I guess that's part of tolerance. I know I see a lot of discussion on costs, and some people get very dismissive on looking at the costs of game. But if you're not in the US or Japan, there's a very significant difference in cost of what the games cost. There's VATs or additional taxes. Sometimes it's really, really expensive. I believe I want to say Sydney Butler, who's been on the show before, who lives somewhere in South Africa. I want to say that the retail cost on the shelves for PS5 is somewhere in the ballpark of what would be about 850 to 900 US dollars. So understanding, listening to people and understanding that that's, if you see somebody complain about price, you might immediately think, well, they're not trying to support the developers or something. But if you listen and get through what people's requirements are and kind of learn why they are what they are, it does help to kind of reinforce how we can support each other as gamers, to go, oh, a lot of people can't get the same cost access to these games and to these systems, which is, I don't actually own Game Pass. I don't think I have enough time to play enough games that I think it's great. I think it's a great value. I think it's a great try before you buy. I wish every indie had a chance to get on it so that people could say, this is a great game, I'm going to buy it. That's big for cost accessibility for a lot of people globally. And some of these people may not, you may be looking at directions where you may have TVs or sticks And now people don't have to buy expensive hardware. And somebody may dismiss that very early on because it's initially a price conversation. So I think not only knowing ourselves is good, but it can lead to greater places of understanding if we can kind of know other people and try to cohesively be really the best community that we can be.
Yeah, that's important. Just sticking on that Game Pass topic, right? Again, to know and try to understand other consumers, right? Like I would say I would claim, right? I would propose that look, if you're buying a system for a kid, right? An Xbox Series S is more than a kid needs because I don't know that 13-year-old should be wrapped around the axle about whether or not they're playing in 4K. You know, Xbox Series S does upscale, so they'd get that 4K anyway. But that's a for instance, right? And then I go, okay, look, little Tommy, little Johnny, little Susie, you're coming at me asking me to buy you a $60 game. Um, you don't work, so now I'm going through that evaluation. I'm like, I don't know that I want to be bothered with that, right? I don't know if I want to have that conversation every month, right? How about I just give you Game Pass? I put parental controls on your Xbox to limit your gaming time, right? I haven't dug into the parental controls on the Xbox. I'm hoping that there's a way that you could say, hey, they can't play MA titles or whatever, right? But that would be a cost effective means for you to render that entertainment and allow them to participate in it at an age where, I for kids, I think this extends to some adults too, because they haven't necessarily like come to that point of maturity, right? Look, if you don't know what you want, I go back to previous lives of mine, and I'm like, I spent $60 games, $60 on games and titles that I never finished, right? There's an argument there that spending that $15 a month, right, for little Tommy, Johnny, Susie, right, who doesn't know themselves as a gamer, right, because they haven't gotten to a point where they can articulate that. Maybe that's a fine vehicle for them. Apple Arcade, kind of the same thing. It lets them dabble, right? It lets them sample, a lot of different things to try and figure out what it is they like about a thing. As you mentioned, might be cost effective for a lot of people who, in this world, are out of work, maybe not be in their optimal job that they were in before, whatever. It's nice that there are price point options throughout the industry now for people.
That's really good. I that's the one aspect of Game Pass that I didn't think about is if I don't know what I want, right? Because I mean, you and I have been gaming since we were little. Like, I mean, we experienced a very different generation of gaming, and I sometimes I forget how many people are coming into gaming. How would they know what they want? So in order to get to that place of gamer know thyself, you have to start playing games. And like, they probably won't play indies. They'll probably play more popular titles. They'll probably play AAA, maybe what their friends are playing. So I didn't really think about that. The Game Pass is a great opportunity for them to kind of get to know what they like, which actually I never really thought about it before. That might be why people flock to reviews. I'm not crazy about reviews because I don't like the idea. I used to, until I talked to Alex, Bokey's brother, who is a journalist, and we were talking about it, and he completely convinced me that giving a score numerically is kind of worthless. Like, we all perceive value differently, and if you think about it, everything is kind of subjective. So just deciding to put a number on a game seems strange to me, especially when a newer generation of people, like, I don't know about you, but when I was, say, a teenager, if something said a 5 out of 10, I said, oh, that's average, that's not bad. Now you say a game's a 5 out of 10 and they're like, that's trash, that's whatever they say now. So I'm just wondering if, because the industry's growing, we have more attention to some of the kinds of content that can get more toxic and that can kind of muddy the waters a little bit. And maybe that's why we do have more dynamic of people not quite maybe knowing what they want yet.
It's. I mean, to talk about reviews, so it's all weighed into it by saying, look, I'm comfortable with reviews because I've just had to live with them. All, I'm unfortunately getting to the point where I've been around for so long that they've been around for so long. I bought the first issue of Game Pro magazine like off the rack because I walked into the grocery store and and literally the magazine rack was like the old carousel type that like you turn and was like a wireframe thing. And I went up to the magazine rack and spun it around, and there was Game Pro magazine. I'm like, what in the world is this? It's a gaming magazine. It's the first issue ever, and I bought it. Um, so so I've had to live with that regime being around for a while. To me, one of the conversations we started today about I'll call it kind of this extensible model of the eROI conversation. The quad chart that you and I have now, but then now your extension of the meme to the different factors of game design on podiums. Um, there, to me, it's a matter of how you consume them. And again, this is a thing that I had to kind of come around and contend with very early. And my approach on reviews is that I understand and I accept as a norm that every reviewer is biased. I think Akira kind of made some mentions on Twitter that are synonymous with this, right? Everybody's got a bias, right? I know a lot of websites will claim that their reviews are not subjective and are unbiased, and I'm like, kind of think that's a load of malarkey, right? It's like everyone has an inherent bias, right?
Hmm.
I, I'm African American. I have a bias with the way that I see things. You're Caucasian. You have a bias with the way you see things, right? Not those biases aren't bad. It's simply the fact that how we were raised. I got raised and trained to do certain things. So when I see a thing happen, I react a certain way based on the way that I was trained. That's a bias, right? And that's different than another person will react to them.
So you're
So,
saying
so
that culturally, the way that people are raised, and it could be, I mean, your religion or your family values or or anything like that. It we're taught that when we're little because that's kind of ingrained. That okay. I just wanted to make sure I was
yeah,
understanding. Okay.
yeah. So therefore, every review has a bias. Every review has a tilt. Every game is seen through a certain lens, right? We talk about tolerances, right, in games. I'm a person who I take tests well. I don't take long tests well, right? So when I analog make that analog to games, when a game I talk about it as a game that overstays its welcome, right? There's a certain amount of entertainment ROI that it provides within a certain time, and when I exceed my threshold for that, right, but the game starts to head downhill for me, right? A simple game like Art of Rally, for instance. I'm a big racing game player. I'm a big rally game player. Art of Rally doesn't have all of the complexities as a full size like Dirt Rally 2.0 by Codemasters, and so Art of Rally hits a point where it has overstayed its welcome for me. I can take playing that game for maybe an hour at a time, and then I get ready to put it aside and move to another thing. So to me, all reviewers have a bias. All reviews have a bias. That score that somebody appends to that has a bias. The way I consume reviews is I read enough reviews and see the elements in them. And I was better about this in the past when there were fewer reviews running around. But PC Gamer magazine, Game Pro magazine, again back when we had magazines, a lot of these writers and editors were people that I came to understand what was important to them and understood how the reviews were written. And then I would say, okay, that person's review of that thing probably rings true with the way I would look at it. So I'm not going to do a thing. And then it's a matter of how you consume them, and then it's a matter of how you use them. Today, in today's world, right, wrong, and different, I use reviews as a filtering mechanism. Look, and we've talked about that. I don't have time to play all of the games that are out. I'm judicious with that time. So at my core gaming, I'm just not going to play a lot of 60% games because I'm not. And again, it's how you approach it. I could say that I'm a shooter person and I love shooters, and so the score of a shooter doesn't matter because I'm in love with that genre. Um, and if that's your gaming vector, then that works for you, and reviews maybe don't matter. I'm not necessarily squelched, I shouldn't say that. So I might approach simulation games that way. I approach Nintendo games that way. My threshold for review scores is different on Nintendo platforms than others because that platform doesn't necessarily have kind of what my core makeup is. So I move that around. But I'm a person who finds a certain degree of value in reviews. Now I think where some of the arguments that I've seen on Twitter say, I don't buy a game that's an 88 and then say to myself, this is an 88 game.
Mhm.
I buy a game that's an 88 because that's in my engagement threshold for picking up a game. And then how I feel about that game, I decide, right, how I feel about that game after I spent some time with it. So I don't know. It's just, to me, it's a matter of like how you perceive it, how you consume it, and then how you use it. But I also feel like, yeah, the people who say there are a lot of people who say you should make up your own mind and you shouldn't use reviews, and bless their hearts, that they have the time to do that. I personally don't, but I'm glad that there are gamers who are willing to go down that road, and it's interesting. Actually, one of my co-hosts on the E2KG Weekly show, I asked him about it on a show one time, and I said, because he said he was going to pick this game up, and I'm like, how do you decide like what games you're going to pick up like before they launch? And he's like he's a genre guy or a game design elements guy. He's like I see that the game has elements and factors that appeal to me, and I'm willing to roll the dice that the game's going to be good. And I just accept that sometimes I'm going to see things in trailers and pre-builds and gaming footage beforehand, and that I may buy that game, and I may decide that still it's not for me.
I'm the same way. I know what, and that's changed over time. I used to play a lot of back. Oh my god, the original like Call of Duties, like those first couple Modern Warfares were so good, man. Loved them back then. So I mean, I go through phases and I change, but I kind of have an idea what genre I like. There are some franchises that like I'm pretty sure I'm gonna enjoy Far Cry 6. I prefer to play a game to just so I don't. My biggest reason for not looking at reviews, honestly, it almost it almost kept me from playing The Last of Us 2. It really did. It almost kept because I wasn't that big into the franchise. I hadn't played the first one yet. I didn't really know what to expect. So I almost had an amazing experience blown because I and I'm always conscious, how influential am I? I mean, advertising, marketing, that's a big business. Like media is everywhere trying to sell us. So I'm very just me and my preference. I'm very cautious about how much I'm sold. So I kind of like to go in without a lot of like, I don't want to see a lot of stuff. I don't want to have a lot of stuff. But again, everybody should consume what you feel good about. If that's part of your eROI is absorbing reviews and reading bits and pieces of it, that's what you should be doing. And nobody should get to tell you that you're wrong on that. And we are totally we're all biased, dude. We're all completely biased. If I play a game that has a great story, I will overlook other shit. I may not even realize it, but I can almost promise you I will look over other shit. And like I was talking to on Lovable today on Twitter, I don't care how beautiful the game is and how great the graphics are. If the story is just really one dimensional and doesn't captivate me, I can almost promise you that bias will slip in that doesn't make it as great of a game for me.
Yeah, and I definitely appreciate that. I think part of what I talked about on that thread, but more so on some others, and the only reason I actually injected a comment on the thread is because so often I've seen that vector of conversation go to a point where they say there are elements of game design that don't matter, and I'm like, okay, hold on a second, right? I I get I get none, and I understand that those things are more important to you, but I don't know that I could accept that there are elements of game design that don't matter.
They
The other
all
big
matter. They
right,
all
right,
matter.
right. And the other thing for me, I know for me, they're also subjective, right? Not subjective. They're also what's the word I'm looking for? They, they they're also contextual, right? And maybe
Very.
situational. A game or a title can do a thing. So Microsoft Flight Simulator, for instance, love flight sims. Doesn't have as much story. You see my eROI. I don't know that Microsoft Flight Simulator has the cognitive load or cognitive context that I'd be looking for that typically is rendered by strategy games, etc. Um, but but I love the graphics and I love the visuals, and so when there are sometimes other elements of a thing that I'm looking for, it doesn't have a progression model in it, which is the thing that I'm normally very big in. Um, but but it's situational, right? That's still a game that appeals to me. We talked on that Gamer Know Thyself episode before in the eROI thing where I talked about stretching legs of the triangle, right? And we talk about this in a lot of like business dealings, right? Where you can there are certain legs of the triangle that are fixed. You know, typically when you pull on one leg of a triangle, the other two sides have to move along with it. You can't really pull one without moving the other, and so you have to understand what that acceptable elasticity is within your own formula, right? So a Call of Duty, a Division Two. I go back to the gunplay things. Those are games that maybe don't provide everything that I'm looking for, but there's a particular vector that they are really great at that causes me to, like you said, overlook the other things. Um, I was listening to a podcast last week, and it was a listener who was asking a question actually, and it's an element of this conversation that I also give credence to. It's time, right? I will admit that I can articulate all of these different factors of the things that make me happy, but I have to pump the brakes and say and notice, and I'm a little less religious about this than I used to be, but I am somewhat conscious of the amount of time that I spend on different titles. And a couple of years ago, when we did our equivalent of Game of the Year stuff, I said, look, I don't know that I could tell you that Destiny 2 is the greatest game in the world, but I have to acknowledge and give some credence to the fact that when I look at the amount of gameplay time that I spent on a given title that year, the amount of time I spent on Destiny 2 was egregiously higher than what I'd spent on other things. And I'm like, you can't dump that much time into a game and just ignore whether or not it's your favorite game of that year. Like that has to be a conversation that I feel like you have to have with yourself and true that up, right? And make right have a conscious thing to convey or a conscious argument to make about why it is or why it isn't.
That makes total sense. I'm trying to think of the year. Fallout 4 came out in, oh, geez. I don't remember the year, but if I had to pick, I know I picked a game of the year for myself that year, and it wasn't Fallout 4. But I love Fallout 4. I played that game probably close to 900 hours, and that's the most I've ever logged in any game ever. That counts for something. So that's a really interesting, like, you could almost say that that could be my game of the, in some, I mean, technically, if you looked at it, that's, should that, I mean, that's at the top of my list. I've never played any other game that much, even if I love other games more. So it's just really interesting that you say that. You always have me thinking, and I don't even, Flight Simulator, I would love to play that game. Like, I want the biggest, craziest rig to play that game on. I don't need story. I don't need any of my normal stuff. That looks incredible. And like that's what's so beautiful about gaming is if it's, it like you said, the elasticity, it just looks beautiful and I want to play it, damn it. Oh, I was circling back to you. I was letting you go with the next
Oh no.
topic. Sorry. I saw you unmute and mute and unmute, and I was like, wait a minute, I was done for real.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's another kind of interesting vector, to round that discussion out too, which is, there's all of us have this place of Zen, right? And we talk about, and so it's maybe a statement to like create this corner to right this pocket where we can also let our hair down a little bit because we get we just had a conversation a few weeks ago about like pretentiousness in games and with gamers, and and we talk about art house game. And so a lot of the discussion on Twitter that's been about story and art, we kind of talk about those on our podcast as art house games. And I go back to those like that statement about like Oscar winners and things in the movie industry. And so there are a lot of art house games, right? And there are a lot of like nostalgic and emotional loves. Those have a plane of value, right? They're not necessarily again the thing that I'm necessarily gonna dump a ton of time into, right? But I try and acknowledge what those things are about. But by the same token, there are also these pockets that are, I guess, kind of analogous to maybe like the B movie effect in the movie industry, right? And I'll pick a thing, for example, shmups, right? Shmups are a thing. You kind of go into them, you kind of turn a lot of brain cells off. It's all a bunch of twitch mechanics, right? But there's a certain zen, right? There's a certain kind of runner's high, right, that you can experience when you play those games. And as you mentioned, right, I don't necessarily know that I need a lot of the other elements that I talked about are important, right, junked into that formula for a shmup to be of value, right, to me. So I don't know. I, I try and make sure in conversations, right? And again, not with your comments, but with things, because I've seen where that slippery slope where people just completely tumble down that hill to where they say, "Oh, well, teraflops don't matter." Like, hold on a second, right? Teraflops matter, right? Okay, fine. We can have an argument that maybe they're not the most important thing, or maybe they shouldn't be the thing that wins the day. I get that, right? But GPU needs to perform a certain number of operations per second, right? Or developers can't make the games that they want to make, right? So it would be great if on Twitter we could get to a place where there are spaces for each of the conversations and everything doesn't have to boil down to a binary or you know I don't know.
No, that makes total sense. I mean, everything matters in the design, in the technicality, but it might not matter to you. Like one of the things I try to keep in mind, your favorite game is could be somebody else's absolute worst, most horrible flop ever. And your worst game, like this is the worst game I've ever played, might be somebody's favorite game. And that's supposed to be the beautiful part of what we're doing, connecting in the gaming community. I mean, I drive a 4-door Honda Fit 6-speed because I'm practical and I like to be El Cheapo. Okay. So in my car, horsepower don't matter. But you better believe the last time I went to Vegas, I paid an absurd amount of money to drive a Ferrari around a track because you damn right. The way that puppy roars, that was set. I mean, yeah, that I like cars. I like that stuff. But in my own practical life, I don't have that. So it's just people like what they like and they get the joy out of what they get the joy. And we have to kind of be mindful that that's different for everybody. And I think we can all just try to be super inclusive of everybody's. I don't always understand everybody's opinion, but that's okay. I don't have to. And that's the beauty about it. But this all matters. Hardware matters. The technical stuff matters. I mean, everything matters to somebody, even if it doesn't matter to you.
Yeah, and to me, and I go back to or maybe it's a Kira statement too of like not really like Kira talked about gamers not knowing what they want. I often have a difficulty understanding what people want out of their conversations. On Twitter. I keep coming back to Twitter as the example, but
They don't
it
know.
applies to yeah, it applies to other social media too. Like to me, let's pick at The Last of Us 2, right? Not my favorite game, right? But I go back to the thing that I said earlier. I spent a chunk of time in The Last of Us 2. I probably probably 38 hours because I did 2 runs, not to completion, right? So that's a thing too.
Hmm.
Um, but I spent a lot of time invested in that game. But to me, the thing that would be interesting, right, is when you and I have a conversation about what we liked and what we didn't like about The Last of Us 2, and and part of the problem in the conversations is we just you and I do, right? But the gamer community writ large, right? In this notion of the citizens of the gaming community don't always create the space for us to have that flavorful textured conversation, as Gurnico kind of refers to it, that allow us to talk about those different levels, right? You either have to completely love a thing or completely despise and trash talk a thing, and you can't talk about the over under, right? There are things like in your diagram, like for me, there are elements of the combat in The Last of Us 2 that I didn't like, right? And there are elements of the way the story was conveyed that I didn't like, admittedly, because of things that I perceived in the walk up to its release, right? That's a whole other factor, is how early should gaming companies start talking about a game, how much footage should they show beforehand. I got given an impression of what I was going to experience in The Last of Us 2 that was different than what I experienced, right? And and that thing that was missing created a loss of adhesiveness for me, right, in my engagement with the story. So, but if you and I have a conversation about it, what I'd love to hear is the things that appeal to you, the things that appeal to me, and that back and forth.
Yeah.
Not one of us has to win that argument, right? And each of us have to settle on a binary. Um, so it just makes it tough to kind of incorporate all
Yeah.
those things.
Well, like we said earlier, there is no right or wrong when it comes to an opinion. I mean, you could both be right, but you don't have to force it in each other's face. The episode that was on last week, folks haven't seen it yet because neither that has aired yet, and this hasn't aired yet. We talk about that dynamic. It's actually about, does hype ruin games, and we talk about misleading marketing and stuff like that. When I really think about it, there are games I've played that I said, man, I do not like this game. I didn't like it. It's not for me. I really didn't enjoy it, but it was not a bad game. And then I look at games that I really loved, like Horizon Zero Dawn and Last of Us 2 and Grand Theft Auto 5. Those games were not without flaws. It's just, that's the way there's no such thing as a perfect game, even though I can have incredible optimal fulfillment from it. And I've seen like, Joey ended up loving Sea of Thieves, and some people ditched on the game. It doesn't matter if you love it and other people think it's a bad game. Like, let people like what they like. I really enjoy getting other people's perspectives of something that I'm completely different on, because there's a real beauty in being able to understand people and come together. And I just feel like it's really special. And I don't think that everybody's necessarily malicious in intent. They're just going into it with this myopic vision that they maybe can't separate their passion and emotion and their opinion from someone else's experience and how someone else gets joy.
Yep, no, that's a really great point.
Oh, I like that you unmuted just to say that. Like, you always stay so muted. So when you unmute, is Logic just going to say a little comment, or is there going to be like this big piece of golden content that we don't really? So do you have any, before we wrap up, is there anything else that you want to bring up, or like anything burning that you want to say, or anything else that you have to add to this kind of dynamic that we're talking about?
No, I mean, I think the summary of the conversation is kind of, as you mentioned, right? Gamer know thyself. Like, figure out, like, I don't know if it's the right analogy or the best analogy to help it, but like, take some time to write down on paper, right, or on an iPad or whatever your choice of medium is, right? Take some time to write out, that Marie Kondo answer, right, to the thing that gives you joy in gaming, right? Take charge of it. Don't let it be something that is just happenstance, or much less determined by other people, or other influences on social media, right? Take some time to understand who you are, because my feeling is, um, the again, these big decisions that we make in life, right? Like, the worst thing you can do is buy a house and not understand what your requirements are. The worst thing you can do is, settle down with somebody that's a lifetime partner and not understand what you're not looking for, right? When we use that analog, you know, much of my earlier dating life was not about finding out what I wanted. It was almost entirely about going through the experiences that taught me what I didn't want, right? And learning to pick up the signals of, like, okay, I'm going on a date with this person. When I hear that drum beat, that's my signal to get out, right? So formulate those things and write those things down, right? And figure out who you are as a gamer, right? And the answer today might not be right. It may just create the spaces of things that you want to investigate or the things that you want to kind of pick at, you may not come up with a this is what I am, right? But I think it's helpful. And then when you're engaging in conversations, right? I feel like as we went through the conversation we just went through, I just thought about like, if the conversations on if the typical conversation gaming conversation on Twitter was a podcast, I don't know that I would listen to that podcast, right? I don't know if I would listen to a podcast of a bunch of people who were religiously rooted in their own myopic opinion and didn't allow for room or space in the expression of others, right? The podcasts that I enjoy are the podcasts that are highly textured, where there's a difference of opinion between hosts and there's a back and forth and an arbitration of coming to an understanding of how they each perceive the game. If I listened to a podcast that was four people all in love with a thing for all the same reason, just being an echo chamber and reinforcing right what the same opinion, I don't know that that would be an interesting podcast. Like, why would I listen to that? So to me, it's almost it's risky analogy. It's almost like I want to say try and have the conversations on Twitter that you'd want to hear on a podcast because I think the average good podcast is about differences of opinion and people working those things out and coming to an understanding and giving everybody a chance, right, to convey what it is they like about a game and what they don't like about a game. Um, because podcasts are that next step up of communication medium, right, beyond a review, as you mentioned, right. In a review, you get a single person's take, right, but in a podcast, you get multiple gamers, right, talking about a given title, or even just talking about elements of a title, even if they haven't all played it, right, in terms of hearing what it is they like and what it is they don't like about different aspects of games, and whether or not they feel like a given title is tolerable or would be tolerable, right, to them, given kind of their own biases, right, in the lenses that they perceive games through.
Wow, it's almost like diversity is a good thing. I mean, we hear people just sometimes go on and on about it, but that's what's so fucking cool about diversity is when you blend things in. I mean, like with food, right? When you blend more flavors into food, right? Everything changes on your palate and your if you don't ever want to try new foods or you don't ever want to experiment with things, you might be missing out. And I'm not saying that you can't stick to your eROI and do things the way that you do, but when it comes to other people and their opinions, it can be really good to branch out. We all deserve to have our opinions respected, and just please respect other people's opinions. And if it's something that you feel emotional about or really passionate about, you don't have to say anything. You don't have to engage. If you do and it gets too far down the rabbit hole, walk away. Have gaming is so much fun. Don't don't drag the fun out of it for yourself, and don't drag the fun out of it for other people. But as we wrap up, I would encourage everybody, do your eROI, or at least think about it. It's really cool to sit down and start writing things out and going through what brings you happiness. It's very, very neat to do that. It's opened up my eyes a lot. It's solidified a lot of decisions I've made, and it's allowed me to say I'm going to get less myopic about certain genres because things I wouldn't have normally tried might meet this criteria. So that's why I thought this would be such a great episode, and it was.
Yeah, the last thing I'll tag on to that is I'm picking at this new concept in theory that I haven't quite nailed down yet, but this notion of a citizen of the gaming community, right, or a gaming citizen, and that notion when you kind of go back to the history of ancient Rome, and other first kind of burgeoning outlets of the nation state, right, and participants of the nation state is there's an obligate I want gamers to participate in the dialogue, right, the democratization, right. We used to only get, I go back to those magazines and those reviewers, that used to be the the only dialogue that we would ever get, or really monologue that we would really get about games, right? It was very a one way transmittal medium. We now have the opportunity to have a multi-vectored conversation, right? And so it's a responsibility of a gaming citizen to participate, right? To convey their opinion. We want that, but it's also a responsibility of a good citizen, right? To allow everyone to have an opportunity to voice, right? A voice, careful, conscientious weighing of that opinion, right? Not dismissing it out of hand, not immediately declaring it invalid because it doesn't meet with yours, right? Go back to the early thoughts of citizenship, and the core thought around it was that, as you mentioned, right, multiple diverse opinions and perspectives being voiced allows for better consensus, right? And so we need to create platforms and spaces, a pantheon, right, an amphitheater, right, where those things can be conveyed and everyone gets a chance to stand up and participate and voice an opinion. I even have to say bad on me, right? I tend to often be dismissive of the negative opinions, I think because of the way in which they are voiced and the
Mhm.
way that they are, people make an attempt to weaponize them, right, is was what I rail against, right? If people would work on how they vector those, right, and voice them in a little more egalitarian manner, right, then I still think it's important for those opinions, right, to be out there, right. It's still important for people to say, they think The Last of Us 2 is the best game ever, or they don't think The Last of Us 2 is a good game. But the important thing is that there be an amphitheater for those opinions to be shared, not an amphitheater for one of those opinions to be shouted down, right, to zero volume at so that the voices of others can rise to the top.
Yeah, that's a good point. Is it's really how you hi Mushu. I know you can see yourself. It's really how you communicate it. I mean, so if I say, "Well, I really love The Last of Us 2. I loved the combat in that game." And if somebody inserts themselves and say, "I wasn't crazy about the combat of the game, but I like this," or maybe somebody asks questions, you engage, that's I don't find that to be negative. Negative doesn't mean somebody doesn't share your opinion, right? Negative doesn't mean somebody's thinking opposite of you. I look at negative as somebody going in like, that's a trash ass SJW like opinion, and that's that just, I mean, have more respect than that. That stuff, I mean, I wouldn't engage with that. So I think being kind of objectively fair about what negative really is and isn't. Sometimes people aren't trying to be negative. They might want to open a conversation with you about what they didn't like and what you did like. So I think there's a difference between wanting to do that in a positive, friendly way and saying, I'm just going to shit. Because some people just want to shit in your cereal, man. Just, let's not give those people attention. A lot of clout chasing gets attention. A lot of clownery gets attention. We are the majority, the small content creators, and we've stayed quiet. So maybe we just don't stay as quiet anymore, and we can do that and be really positive and be really uplifting, and we can just bring all the other like gamers and small content creators, and we can bring each other up. We can rise up, game junkies. Word. Logic, give me the word. Anything else you want to say before we part ways with the show?
Now I'm good. I'll just reinforce what you just mentioned. Right, it would be so great if like the our daily conversation would be more of us opening topics and allowing all of the Avengers, right, to participate in that conversation and offer their opinion. And it would be so much. It would be so great, right, if that was our conversation in the vast majority, rather than us having time to give any attention, right, to some kook, right, posting about you know some outlandish, right, postulate that they're trying to make in order to get attention.
Word up. You heard it here first. When logic speaks, it's logical, guys. So you heard it here first. Thanks, as always, for watching. And thanks, Logic, for being an absolutely amazing co host. Another fantastic episode. Just banger after banger after banger guest on the show. I couldn't ask for anything greater. So thanks so much for watching. And we will see all of you guys next week.